Hi, this is Michael from BetterTOEFLScores.com, and today I am interviewing a student. His name is Bar Meltzer, and I've had the privilege to meet Bar as an English 306 student at California State University, San Bernardino, and I just found out in my last class session that he was actually a TOEFL student a few years back, and his TOEFL score right now is 105 out of 120. His writing score was 30 points out of 30. His listening score was 29 out of 30. His reading score was 27 points out of 30, and his speaking was the hardest one. He had 19 points out of 30, but overall he did a really good job on the TOEFL. And also, as a side note, he's an excellent writer. He writes very well in my expository English 306 class, and he's one of my best students. Today I'm going to ask him some questions about his English language background, and then we're going to talk about vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, speaking, writing, listening, and reading as possible tips that might help some of the audience understand what kinds of things need to be done before you actually take a TOEFL test. So Bar, my first question has to do with your English language background. So you can talk about your being here in the United States before. You can talk about some of the things that you did when you were in Israel in terms of studying English.
I was born in Israel, and I started from 3rd grade, I believe. We start to learn English in school, so it's a second language, and you go till 12th grade, so you have a pretty good understanding of English once you're done. The second thing is that my father is American. As a child, I used to speak, I would talk to him in English most of the time, and it's when we're at home it was English, when we were away it was Hebrew, so that gave me a pretty good sense of English, of talking. I mean, when I finished high school, eventually I got to the university, and the university, most of the courses were in Hebrew. Some of them you had to read some English books, and when I came to the States, I lived here for about 3-4 years before I went back to school. So you get a lot more experience once you're out there and you're talking, and through conversations and through reading books and being exposed to television.
It sounds like, Bar, that you've had a lot of exposure with English from what you're telling me at a very young age, and I've noticed that a characteristic of what we call really near native fluent English speakers, one of the characteristics is they are introduced to the new language at a fairly early age, was kind of what you're talking about now. Yeah, I was going over Bar's TOEFL score results, and his reading section was 27 out of 30. His listening was 29 out of 30. His speaking was 19 out of 30, and his writing was 30 out of 30. Still, you got 105 out of 120. Now, in the next part of the video, I want to look at 7 different areas, beginning with vocabulary, then grammar, then pronunciation, then speaking, then writing, then listening, and then reading. So, first of all, let's start with vocabulary. Vocabulary is pretty important for the TOEFL. In order to read well, to listen to academic lectures, to write well, to speak well, you have to have some knowledge of college-level vocabulary. And that's my first question. Obviously, to get 105 out of 120, you have good vocabulary. So what are some advice that you might give other students who are preparing for the test in terms of their vocabulary skills?
Well, Michael, I think vocabulary is mostly based on your experience or exposure. It means that you have to read a lot, whether it's, you start with books that you feel that, comfortable with, and you can watch television. You can, through different media sources. It's also about, being in another country and, learning the language because you have to. That's the only way you can basically survive. So I'm fortunate in a way that I had those things. I had that exposure. But I think before the TOEFL test, there's a lot of things that you can practice on, and obviously the more you practice, the better you get. Vocabulary is one of them. Just reading books, trying to read a higher level material. If you can read articles and and just be exposed to more vocabulary.
Okay, thanks, Bar, for that good information. A lot of the students I interview, they always seem to focus a lot on reading, and reading seems to be very important for building one's vocabulary. All right, let's go to the next point, grammar. Now, the TOEFL test does not have a grammar section. There's no grammar section like the paper-based test or other previous TOEFL tests. However, it does say in order to score high on the writing and the speaking sections of the test, you have to use advanced grammar structures with a high degree of accuracy. It also says on the writing and the speaking, in terms of being scored by the human raters, that you don't want to just use basic grammar accurately. So it is possible that a student could write and speak on the TOEFL and have correct grammar but still get a lower score. And the reason the person will get the lower score is because he or she is using basic grammar structures. So that is my next question. So what is some things that students can do in terms of preparing for the test so that they can improve their grammar knowledge, but not just kill and drill grammar, but being able to apply grammar to writing and speaking situations?
Michael, that's a good question. And again, I go back to actually reading and experiencing grammar. I mean, it's basically looking at sentences and structure, understanding, the forms, and really before the test, practice a lot and make sure that you're exposed to that, to higher standards or better grammar, and that you have the ability to use the grammar to do better in the test. And I think again it goes back to how much experience you gain, how much you worked and practiced on it, how much reading you've done, and all of those are important factors in the test.
Now, in addition to vocabulary and grammar, there's one more area that I like to talk about, and this area, like the other two, is actually not directly tested on the TOEFL, but is pronunciation. And that's what I want to talk about right now. Now, I've noticed this is probably the reason you got a lower score on your speaking of 19 out of 30. So in your pronunciation right now, I think you have a bit of a lisp. A lisp it involves the tongue, where you place the tongue when you actually speak, and that interferes a little bit in your ability to be understood. So probably on the TOEFL, when you got your score, part of your lower score on the speaking was it required some effort on the TOEFL IBT human raters part in order to understand you, and I know that was a challenge. Now, you also mentioned to me that speaking in front of the microphone was one of those things you weren't quite used to. So thinking about the microphone, thinking about speaking and pronunciation proficiency, what advice would you give students who are preparing for the test and they want to try to have as clear pronunciation as possible?
Thank you. You said it right, Michael. Basically, the pronunciation was my hardest part. There's two things. First of all, when you're sitting in a test, you have to remember that you have about a minute, around 45 seconds to a minute to speak. Before that, you have about a minute to write down what you need to talk about. Now, you're in a class, there's a lot of other students taking the test at the same time. You're going to hear them in the background. That's kind of distracting. So you have to really focus on what you're doing. I think one of the hardest parts for me is really speaking clearly, and I wasn't able to do so during the test. And I guess that's part of the reason that my grade was so low on the speaking part. And again, it's speaking clearly, it's knowing what you want to say, thinking about it before you actually answer, and it's talking, speaking to the point. That's the other problem that I have had in the test. And I found it difficult, especially because I didn't practice before, on the speaking part, and I didn't think about, the idea that somebody's going to stick a microphone in my mouth and I'll have to talk, and I mumble. I mean, that's part of who I am, and so, that was the other problem. So, thinking back on the test, I would have changed by, practicing enough in front of a microphone, seeing that I'm doing better, speaking clear, concentrating on what I needed to do and what I needed to say, and being really focused and saying it clearly.
Now let me make just a small correction. On the TOEFL test, Bar said that you have about a minute to prepare for the speaking test. Unfortunately, on the TOEFL IBT, on the 2 independent speaking tasks, you have 15 seconds to prepare. So you have a very, very short amount of time. Now on the integrated speaking tasks, you can have anywhere from 20 seconds to 30 seconds to prepare for those, but it is difficult. Now one thing I want to expand on Bar's idea about directly focusing on the topic, and there's a trick that you can do on the TOEFL that's very helpful. Is whatever the question is, when you're making the topic statement of the speech, turn that into your topic statement. For example, if it asks you a question on the independent speaking task and it says, what are the qualities of a good roommate, for example. So when you begin your speech, you say the characteristics or qualities of a good roommate are. So you take the question, turn it into a statement, and that kind of gives you a focus to the speech. It helps your purpose. It makes the purpose of the speech very clear. Now, I like your other suggestion, and in the audience, you guys need to understand, like Bar said, you will be in a computer room, and it's very likely that there are other speakers in that room. So you should not be distracted by them. You need to really concentrate on what you're trying to say. Now, on a more complicated level, on the integrated speaking tasks, you also have, it's called, you have to read and then listen, and then they might ask you a question like, how is the information in the listening related to the information in the reading? So with that question, you also have to start the speech something like this. You might say the topic of the reading passage is, state what you think the main idea is, and then say the listening passage is related to the reading in that or because maybe it provides a specific example of the reading. So it's important, like Bar is saying, whatever that question is on the speaking, to make sure that you actually answer that question. It's important. Now we've kind of covered 2 different areas here. We talked about pronunciation, and as Bar was speaking about pronunciation, he also gave some good strategies for the speaking section. And I think what Bar is saying is it's important to be comfortable speaking in front of a microphone. This is not something that a lot of students like to do, but it is important, and I agree 100% with what he's saying there. Okay, let's move on to our next point, writing. Bar got 30 out of 30 on the writing. If anybody has any doubts that this guy cannot write, you should forget those doubts. And I can even tell you, as his professor, he's now in my English 306 class. It's an expository writing class, and Bar writes very well organized essays. He has a good thesis statement. He develops his topics in different paragraphs, and the kind of writing that we're doing right now is a lot more complicated than TOEFL writing. So he does analysis, he does good critical thinking, he argues well in English. So everything about his writing skills are very high. So I think he's got some good suggestions that maybe some of you might want to hear. So maybe my question is, Bar, on the TOEFL IBT, you have an independent writing assignment where you have to write about a personal experience topic in 30 minutes. And they want about 350 words. Now, on the second writing assignment, it's called the integrated writing assignment, in which case students read a passage and they listen to a lecture, and then they have to write a coherent essay of about 150 to 250 words. So either they have 30 minutes or they have 20 minutes. My question is, you got a perfect score. How did you do this? And what advice would you tell students? How can they get 30 out of 30?
Michael, I think when it comes to writing, it comes again to the skills that you have, the vocabulary, how you structure, how focused you are and what you're trying to say. I think the first thing you have to do is remember, how to accomplish a mission. Is basically to plan ahead for it. So the first thing I did is I gave myself kind of an outline, and I knew what I wanted to say. I knew how to organize it. And then the second part is that I didn't use any words that I wasn't familiar with. I didn't try to to be better than what I was. I knew my limitations when it came to spelling, and I made sure that I didn't use any words or structure that I wasn't familiar with. Now, when I started to write, I already had an outline and an idea of what I was doing, so it was much easier, and it came much naturally. And basically, I just it's like filling in from the outline just to develop the sentences and develop it into an essay. And I found it to be easier once I had a clear idea and a clear structure. And again, it's about practice, about taking your time, writing what you needed to write, and finding that which structure works for you, how you develop your essays. I've had experience from before the TOEFL of writing long essays, so it gave me kind of an idea of what I was looking for, to do, and it seems kind of easier for me. Writing is much easier than talking, obviously.
Yeah, I've always been, my dad used to tell me that it's a good idea to focus on your strengths and try not to focus as much on your weaknesses. So your advice about when you're writing to work with vocabulary and grammar structures that you're familiar with, I think is a pretty good idea. The TOEFL test itself, it's not the time to experiment. You need to focus on what works well, what you know. Now, hopefully, that when you are putting together vocabulary and grammar structures, you're using advanced grammar and advanced vocabulary, because if you're not using advanced vocabulary and advanced grammar, you could get a lower score. Now also, you talked about an outline. That's also a pretty good idea. Now I want to explain to my audience that it's very easy to make an outline for the independent type writing assignment. You simply read the question. It might say, would you rather study at home, or would you rather study in a library? Give specific reasons and examples to support your point of view. So you can essentially make a short shopping list of ideas. You can jot down some ideas, and that helps you focus your thoughts, and then you begin writing your essay trying to follow that informal outline. Now, with the integrated writing, it's a little bit more complicated, because basically your outline has to come from your notes. because you have to read an academic passage of about 500 words. You have to listen to a lecture that's 3 or 4 minutes long, and then you have to explain what the relationship is between these two sources. Now, I'm telling everybody that's listening to me right now that if you're a poor note taker and you cannot take notes when you listen and you can't take notes when you're reading, it will be very difficult for you to make a good outline for that part of the writing assignment. So if you have good notes, I think you can succeed on the integrated writing as well. So that's very important. And one more thing I want to advise my audience on is you have to be careful with TOEFL reading passages on the integrated writing. You do not want to copy these sentences word for word, because if you had bar, you didn't. But if they had thought that you had copied sentences directly from the reading passage without paraphrasing them, you would have gotten a score of 0. So the fact that you got such a high score means you have a good ability to paraphrase source material. So you actually have some good writing skills that you've developed over the last few years. All right, let's get to our next point, listening. Listening, a lot of listening. There's a 60 to 90 minute listening section, there's listening on the speaking, and there's listening on the writing section. So what are some things that you think are beneficial for students in terms of improving their listening skills for the TOEFL IBT?
When it comes to listening, that's, a skill by itself. You have to be very, very focused, very concentrate on what's being said. You can write down the things that you're not sure about, maybe figure it out later. Listening at a whole it's more about concentration and about figuring out what's the idea, what they're trying to say, and developing the thought of what's being said. And I think also, going back to what we talked about before, that you have to read pretty quick. The reading parts are going on, at least from my experience. I had to read really fast. Some of the things that was asked for later is I had to kind of skip, and then that kind of connects to the listening part, because some of it is integrated within the listening part. But again, when it comes to listening, I think the main thing is to be focused, to understand what they're talking about, to get a pretty good sense about what's the subject, the topic, what the questions are, and and respond appropriately.
And for a lot of students, listening can be a very challenging part of the test, and unfortunately, because it's so many parts of the test, if a student is not a good listener, it can bring down their score. And as Bar is saying, and one thing I want to reiterate here is the listening does come at you pretty quickly. A lot of these speakers can speak more than 100 to 150 words a minute. So you have to have pretty fast ears to catch the main idea and then the major supporting points. All right, let's go to the last area of the test, which is the reading section. So we've talked about 7 different areas, and now we're getting to the last area. Now, on a TOEFL level, reading is extremely important. But Bar, you also know that at a university level, reading is important. A lot of college textbooks can be 700, 800 pages. It's not unusual for students to take 3 or 4 classes in a term or semester. So there could be thousands of pages that these students have to read. And then the reading passage on the TOEFL, I think it's approximately 60 to 90 minutes. Each reading passage is about 800 to 900 words, and each reading passage is approximately 7 or 8 paragraphs. So keeping in mind that there's reading in the reading section, there's reading in the speaking section, and there's reading in the writing section, what are some things that you think would be beneficial for students in order to do well with TOEFL reading? What's some advice that you would give them in this area?
I think again, it's something that was hard for me as well. You have to make sure that you read the entire sections, and sometimes it can be tricky. You have to time yourself. You have to make sure that even if you don't read the whole thing, you get the main ideas. You have to do everything very fast. You have to make sure that you maintain, you know exactly what the time limits are, and organize yourself in a way that you're going to read the entire thing. Now, the other part of it is, again, it goes back to experience and to practice. You have to make sure that you read passages before you come into the test, so you have some kind of an experience, and make sure that you've done enough reading, that your reading is fast enough, and you can do the reading comprehension part efficiently. So I think those are the things that I would focus on.
And a lot of people suggest, in order to do well on TOEFL reading, that you need to read anywhere from 180 to 250 words a minute, and that's a minimum. If you're reading a little slower than 180 words a minute, you need to really figure out how to increase that reading speed. But I agree with you 100% on that you have to be able to read quickly, you have to be able to concentrate on what you read, and reading college level material before you take the TOEFL test is important. And in conclusion, I thank you, Bar, for taking the time to talk to Better TOEFL Scores and to share some of your experience with the TOEFL test. And again, congratulations on 2 levels. Congratulations, of course, on getting a high 105 out of 120 on the TOEFL. But more importantly, congratulations on your success so far as a university student at California State University, San Bernardino. And pretty soon you'll be graduating, and you'll be going into your career and family and all those kinds of things. So I'm sure that you're going to be very successful in whatever you choose to do with your life. So good luck to you, and thanks a lot.